Welcome to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm health integrationist Lena Berman, and I come to you weekly to discuss the personal politics of health. Wireless technology, it's everywhere. It makes life easier, doesn't it? But how much do you know about the radio frequency radiation that you and your children are exposed to? It shouldn't be surprising that although few articles appear in the media, there's lots of research showing that exposure should be limited. Insomnia, cognitive impairment, heart arrhythmias, psychiatric symptoms, vertigo, and immune suppression are just a few of the symptoms that are documented in humans exposed to radio frequency radiation. These are now common. Offices, restaurants, hotels, and even libraries are scrambling to get on board the wireless train. There are towers everywhere. So what can you do to protect yourself? To begin with, getting educated is a good start. Today I'm joined by environmental consultant and public policy researcher Cindy Sage of Sage Associates. So put down your cell phone for just an hour while you learn about smart exposures to radio frequency and electromagnetic radiation. First, an editorial about this week's health news by Dr. Jeffrey Fawcett.
Thank you, Lena. I've been thinking about miracles. Last week, The Lancet published an article by researchers at Duke University. The research concerned the effectiveness of noetic techniques, spelled like poetic, only with an N. A noetic technique is a method of therapy that doesn't use a tangible substance or medical device. Specifically, what these researchers were examining was the effect of music, imagery, touch, and prayer on heart patients. The newspaper headlines told us that the experiment failed to show a benefit to prayer. That was only part of the story. In reading the research paper, it's clear that the Duke researchers are on the hunt for the positive effects of noetic techniques. Although this experiment wasn't successful, they cite others that were. This is all quite respectable empirical science. Some scientists think something's going on, they have a hypothesis, and they set about methodically uncovering whether something really is going on through experimentation. This is not the case with a growing movement for teaching creationism in schools called intelligent design, the theory that some biological processes can't be explained by evolution and can only be explained by the miraculous intervention of an intelligent designer. Guess who? This is an agenda to suppress or eliminate altogether evolutionary science by claiming that evolution is controversial and doesn't explain everything, and that intelligent design is a viable scientific alternative. It is not. I say this because a science does two things. It explains what scientists observe, and it enables them to test hypotheses through experimentation. If the facts don't fit the theory, scientists take a look at the theory or the experiment or what they see or all three. Like the Texas politician who was all hat and no cattle, intelligent design is all explanation and no experiment. Whatever it is, it's not science. So on the one hand, prayer researchers experiment with the miraculous as a way to learn something about better health. On the other hand, intelligent design advocates promote faith in the miraculous from which we can learn nothing. An explanation clung to faithfully, however comforting, doesn't let our own experience teach us anything. Miracle drugs, miracle cures, the miracles of modern science. Kind of close to intelligent design. You are a scientist. You experience your health, your temperature, the clarity of your mind, your strength, your libido, your aches and pains. You have explanations for why your health is the way it is. It's what you eat, or pollution, or stress, or what have you. And every day is an experiment. When your experience isn't what you expect, you take a look at your ideas and what you did and what happened. You learn. And all you have to do is keep an open mind, an open heart, and pay attention. Pretty miraculous, don't you think? I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. Take care of yourself.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Fawcett. Dr. Jeffrey Fawcett is a political economist, a writer, and a health strategies advisor who works with me on this program and the Progressive Health Observer, a news commentary alternative to big box medicine. In addition to his work on the newsletter, he works with people making health decisions. You can reach him by going to our website, www.YourOwnHealthandFitness.com, or calling 707-874-1496. Now let me introduce my guest, Cindy Sage, and we'll get into our topic, which is smart exposures, how to protect yourself from radio frequency radiation and electromagnetic fields. Cindy Sage is the owner of Sage Associates, and she's been involved in education and research as an environmental consultant and public policy researcher since 1982. She's provided professional consulting services to cities and counties and states nationally, to policy groups on the issue of radio frequency radiation and electromagnetic field policy and prudent avoidance. So we're very pleased to have you back on the show, Cindy. Welcome to you.
Hi, Lena, and thanks very much for inviting me back.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to get you on the air. So one thing I wanted to ask you is, it looks to me as though you've somewhat shifted your attention to more radio frequency radiation rather than electromagnetic, I suddenly can't say that word, electromagnetic field radiation, which I've noticed that people who are afraid of EMF are often people who are actually using cell phones. So can you kind of remind us, give us a short course on electromagnetic fields and maybe where and how they should put their attention to them?
Right. Well, when we first started talking 5 or 8 years ago, much of the public concern was about kids and power lines and cancer or electromagnetic fields. And today, what we've learned in a decade or more of research is that EMF, or 60 hertz power fields from power lines and your electric wiring, it should be considered a 2B category carcinogen, 2B as possible carcinogen. So we've come a long way in recognizing that the science is adequate to really be cautious about unnecessary and chronic exposures to EMF. But more recently, particularly with this huge rollout of wireless technology, people are becoming aware that there are related health effects. And they're asking questions and looking for information about a couple of things. First, what kinds of levels of radio frequency and microwave radiation do we get in everyday life from some of these, devices that we buy, from cell phones, from pagers, from text messengers, from wireless systems for your home and office, and so on. And they're also looking to know what the scientific literature is saying about health effects that may be related. So this is an area where we're getting lots and lots of inquiry.
Before we move away from electromagnetic fields, let's just unpack what you said a bit. Can you kind of make it a little bit simplistic for people? How concerned should they be, and what should they do to protect themselves? I mean, as I think I told you, I had a woman who was concerned about a power pole on a piece of property that she was going to build on, and I suggested that she have PG&E come out, and it was a 2 milligauss pole, which is very, very low. As I pointed out to her, your refrigerator is about 10 milligauss. So when you say that there's evidence of carcinogenesis with electromagnetic field radiation, what levels are we talking about? What kinds of situations should people be avoiding? I mean, aside from being maybe pole climbers for PG&E.
Right. Well, your advice to her is good. You ought to be looking more at the cell phone than a 2 milligauss field. But in reality, what we have learned from a lot of study now and adequate information is that people probably shouldn't be living or working over 1 milligauss. 1 milligauss for chronic exposure is probably a limit we should observe, particularly if we're buying a home or we're creating a workspace or a space in schools. And that 1 milligauss is being observed in the creation of new schools, for example, in California. The average home tests about 0.5 or 0.9 milligauss, so under 1.
You mean even
the average office is 1 to 2 milligauss, which is typical reading. Doesn't mean it's safe, but again, within that range, you need to stay, and above that, you need to be very cautious.
So we're saying that even though a home may have a refrigerator in it, and you may have office equipment in your office. Everything isn't on all the time, and you're not standing next to it all the time. And even if there's a power pole on your property or close to your house, it's not in your house. Is that what we're saying?
Right. Well said. Yeah, you're going to have hot spots in the house related to appliances if you stand very close to them. But generally, the ambient field in a home is going to be something under 1, and that's fine.
And just, again, to put this to bed, the one piece of advice I remember you giving me years ago was to make sure in my office that the little transformer boxes, that equipment, very often pieces of equipment will have converter boxes for the power. So you have these little boxes, transformer.
Little black boxes, right.
Yeah, that those should be plugged in and kept very far from, several feet from your body when you set up your office. That's
absolutely right, yeah. People may not realize that these little transformer boxes or black boxes that you use to charge up your phone or, plug in electrical appliances can produce 200 or 300 or 400 milligauss, but the field will fall off to something under 1 milligauss within 2 or 3 feet.
So
just,
distance
is your friend there.
Distance, yeah. All right. Now, moving on to cell phones, one thing to mention here is that many people have switched from regular phone service now to just using a cell phone for their regular phones, and there are now these new phones in the home that are up at the same level of radiation as a cell phone. Some of these cordless phones in the home
That's
now.
Right. Yeah. That's really of great concern. The levels. Let me back up by saying that there are probably a couple of areas that would be wise to touch on today. One is the issue of cell phones, cordless phones, and brain tumors, and that's absolutely a very current topic to discuss. And also we want to talk about wireless communication systems that include these wireless areas that you can create. They're called WLANs or Wi-Fi or even WiMAX or Bluetooth technologies, and all of them create a localized radio frequency field, and anywhere in that field you simply pick up your device, turn it on, and you have communication. Unfortunately, you also have relatively high radio frequency radiation everywhere in that zone 24 hours a day.
Yeah, it's very important for people to understand. So before we move directly to the brain research, which is fascinating, I made the observation that people with cell phones can't seem to get off the phone. I mean, I don't know whether I'm getting old, but I don't understand this need to be in touch constantly. I've seen people on racing bicycles talking on cell phones. I see people sitting in restaurants eating a meal talking on cell phones, and I'm thinking, do you have to be in touch 24/7? I mean, can't you stop for a moment? And you made a very interesting comment about some research that shows brain changes in the opiate area, in the opiate receptor area when people are on the cell phones.
Yeah, there's some intriguing new science being published that shows that when you put a cell phone to your head, you are actually activating the endogenous opioid system or the reward system of the brain that's linked to addiction. And although we don't have enough science yet to say whether or not using a cell phone is addictive, the behavior certainly seems to be showing it's a possibility, and the biochemistry is showing that it's a possibility.
Yeah, and of course we don't know whether what's really happening is that people just get a charge from not being alone for even 30 seconds during the day, whether
charge may be the wrong word or the right word here.
Right.
But certainly we know that brainwave activity changes within the first 2 minutes of a cell phone call when you're not using a headset. We know that brainwave activity doesn't come back to its normal state for a period of time after you hang up from that call. And of course that's one of the interesting things about the new studies showing that using a cell phone while driving and immediately after you've used that cell phone while driving, the accident rate is is about fourfold, or about 400% increase.
Yeah, which isn't enough to explain just being preoccupied, because you can have a passenger in the cart and you can be talking and you be preoccupied and you change music on your radio and you're preoccupied. So it does have an ominous quality to it. You're referring to a bunch of things that appeared in the news recently. There's in the Associated Press on Tuesday, July 12th, at least in my, let's see, is this the Chron that I've got? Yeah, San Francisco Chronicle: drivers on cell phones found to be 4 times as likely to crash. And then there are several studies that they're citing here. So there's ample research about the brain changes that occur. Most of these studies about cell phone use in the car, again, even when they're hands-free, talk about the similarity to the way the brain and cerebellum work when people are drunk.
Right.
But they never quite, the ones that I scanned here, never quite went as far as to say that they thought that was actually happening. But there's other research that was done, a lot of it by Lai H. Carino, M.A., who is in Washington, I believe, on rats. I guess you can't do this on humans, showing enormous changes in various pathways in the brain, also DNA changes.
Right. Yeah, Henry Lai's work at the University of Washington has shown for more than a decade that you interfere with the ability to orient yourself with spatial orientation after you've exposed animals to radio frequency radiation similar to a cell phone. And he's also shown that with DNA damage, you actually, below the levels that the federal government allows for cell phone exposure, you actually are seeing single and double-strand DNA damage, which is, of course, putting you at increased risk for cancer. He's been a leading researcher in this area for years, but his work now has been replicated in at least 4 laboratories around the world.
Yeah, what's unfortunate here is that nobody has been able to prove that these tumors that are produced as a result of the cell phone use, that they are actually cancerous tumors. I mean, there's been some. I mean, just seeing that there's DNA changes is kind of, duh.
Well, let me just alert your listeners to something that was on CNN today and will be on the Today Show tomorrow.
Yes.
Dr. Keith Black, who is the head of neurosurgery at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, has given an extensive interview at CNN, and he'll do something again similar tomorrow on the Today Show. He was the physician treating Johnny Cochran, the attorney who died last year of a brain tumor. And he is now publicly stating that he believes it's likely that that brain tumor was a result of heavy cell phone use, analog phone, but nevertheless cell phone use. And this is a very major development in the field, because people have been reluctant in the scientific community to say the evidence was adequate to make a statement like that. But Black has said, well, I'm the guy that's taking the tumors out, and I'm the one on the front line, and I'm seeing this. And science may have to catch up, but we need to let the public know. So that is going to be, I think, a watershed moment in this controversy over whether or not cell phone use is going to be linked to brain tumors, and also acoustic neuromas, which are they're benign tumors, but they're tumors of the auditory canal that are really very serious.
Yeah, I think it's better not to have a tumor in your brain, regardless of whether it's reproducing inappropriately. It still can kill you. There's in the notes that the fabulous, wonderful, complete notes that you sent me, you have written here risk ratios for above cancers, meaning brain cancers and acoustic neuromas, doubling to an 800% plus risk.
No, this is the absolutely the latest study produced by Leonard Hardell and Kjell Mild out of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. And what they are now, they have been leaders in looking at, brain tumor cell phone issues. And they're finding that with 10 and 15 years of exposure, which is really all we have for cell phones, that they're seeing 8-fold risk, or 800% increased risk of some kinds of brain cancers. And the problem is here that, the normal latency period for a brain tumor is 20-plus years. And cell phones just haven't been around long enough. But we're beginning to see the evidence at 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, 15 years. So their concern level is very high at the Karolinska Institute, and their publications continue to produce evidence documenting ever higher risks with longer exposure. So, really people ought to be thinking about, if this technology is necessary for your life, where you work or how you live, there are some things that we would recommend that people do to reduce their risk. And I'd like to not only let people know there are some potential problems, but talk more about what you can do in the interim to be prudent and cautious.
Yeah, and we will do that. We will cover that. It looks at the other thing is that you've pointed out that all cell phones, whether they're analog, digital, and that includes cordless telephones, are all bad. And it's interesting that you make a note that analog is the riskiest, because I remember years and years ago that you were saying if you must get a cordless phone, get one of these really old analog ones.
Right. Well, the absolute power output is higher, and we thought with digital, with a more pulsed radio frequency delivery of the signal, it would be more bioactive. Here's the thing we don't know yet. We have seen analog phones in use for 15 to 20 years, so we're seeing the highest rate of brain tumors for them, but it's only because it may only be because of the time period or the latency issue. Digital phones have only really been in use 5 to 8 years at most, so we don't have the history, and we will have to wait until we have 15 to 20 years and compare back to analogs to know the answer to that question. So I think that's really where the uncertainty is today.
Well, and this may also explain this paper that came out that talked about the fact that when people live in rural areas and still have some cell phone service, that their phones have to start roaming on analog a lot. They have to do a lot of that in order to place these calls. And am I correct in saying that they've seen more incidents of neuromas
Absolutely.
and things?
I'm so glad you brought that up because, again, this is another paper by Hardell and Mild out of Karolinska Institute. And what they did was go back and look at their brain tumor data and to disaggregate it between urban people and rural people using phones. And because they knew that in rural areas you tend to have weaker cell phone signal coverage. And what that means is that the cell phone has to work harder to pick it up, and it pumps out more radio frequency in doing so. And if there was really a correlation to the amount of radio frequency coming out of the phone and into your head, it would appear in rural areas. And in fact, that is exactly what they found.
Yeah, I mean,
to a real dilemma here.
Yeah, well, some rural areas like where I am, there's no cell phone service, so it makes it very simple. You just use the cell phone when you're out and about in town. It looks as though Europe, which is another place where people are just walking around with cell phones on their head all day long, has recently completed this program called the Reflex program, which is 12 study teams. Looking at DNA damage. I think we talked about this a little. Do you want to just make a pass at what they were doing?
Yes, and in this context, I know that many of your listeners are getting really mixed messages about, cell phones do produce brain tumors, and no, they don't, yes, they do, and so on. And, being whipsawed like this is a very difficult thing when you're trying to make choices, but when the research program in the United States shut down, it moved to Europe, and it's been well funded, and it's been rather independent. And at the end of a couple of years of study by some very excellent, and there were 12 research teams involved, they were able to show in a credible and scientific way that, in fact, we are seeing DNA damage with cell phone use. We are seeing brainwave changes. We are seeing changes in cell proliferation and cell growth that's aberrant. So this is gold standard science, and we will have to wait for the epidemiology studies to catch up to see how risky it is for people. But the mechanisms now of interaction between radio frequency and microwave radiation from cell phones and changes that may become cancerous is now documented. We're in that period of time where there aren't enough bodies in the street yet for people to know what the risk is. But definitely the mechanism is there, and the science is showing a potential for very widespread risk. given that we have, 1 billion users of cell phones around the world. Even if it's only a very small risk, and it may be a large risk, but even if it's only a very small risk, it is going to be significant in terms of the number of people affected and economic impact.
Well, when you say small risk, it's not in a vacuum where there's no risk. I mean, there are other risk factors that people are swimming in all the time. So you're adding this risk factor onto several other risk factors.
Well, you are. And then think about a family who has gone to an entirely wireless form of living, where it's not just a cell phone, but it's the BlackBerry, it's the WLAN system at school for the kids. All the laptops are wireless. There are cordless phones at home with a little base station there and so on. You can't go to Starbucks or McDonald's today without being in a wireless hotspot. And these wireless hotspots extend out, throwing a radio frequency blanket about 300 feet. So it may be that the cumulative effect is even worse than the brain tumor studies will show.
Oh, I have to think. I mean, you mentioned here the free radical damage. That's a familiar term to people, but it's oxidative damage, which everybody knows there's oxidative damage just by being an oxygen-breathing animal. But there are mechanisms in our body that try to keep up with this, and adding more and more and more and more on top of it, as you point out, results in other chronic diseases. I mean, the whole system breaks down. It becomes like you go into an inflammatory state. So not a good moment.
The best literature on this now is coming out of Columbia University by Martin Blank and Reba Goodman. They've just published a beautiful new study, a biological guide for electromagnetic safety, and they document the stress response. These are researchers who have stuck with this evolving science, and they have now identified places in the genome that are sensitive to radio frequency and to EMF. And they talk at length about what happens with the stress response, with oxidative stress. And it's very well documented as it affects electron transfer now in DNA. So what they're saying is that, if you put a phone to your head once in a while, you may have some damage and your body will hopefully recover. But if you are living in a soup of radio frequency radiation, if you have chosen that lifestyle or you're unable in your daily urban life to avoid it, your body does not have a chance to keep up with DNA repair, and that is a huge concern.
Now, you made some comment about that the research sort of moved out of the U.S. into Europe. Are you saying that researchers have been squashed here in the U.S.?
Well, the research program in the U.S. is no longer funded. There have been many. The money moved, but
I wonder where. Gosh, where could it be?
Yeah. Well, Motorola has been severely criticized as having too heavy a hand as an industry participant in directing the research in this country and also abroad, but they've been less effective abroad. But this Lena, this issue, to bring it back home, we probably get 100 calls a year from communities that are wrestling with new cell towers, and it's one of the areas where we can do the least for them other than provide good computer modeling of what they're likely to see within a community at different locations that they choose. But we're seeing that there is very little way to protect homes and schools and clinics and so on from exposure that's essentially involuntary. And I know up in your area, the community of Bolinas and the Bolinas Fire Department has been wrestling with this issue for many years, and they're facing another round of proposed expansions for a cell tower located on their fire department. And I tell you, it's like any town USA. They're doing a great job of trying to get independent information about what kind of levels of radio frequency they might face and how it might affect a proposed health clinic that is to be built right next door. So this is an area where we would really hope that levels of radio frequency would be held to something under maybe 1/100th of a microwatt for chronic exposure, because the health studies indicate that if you are over that for chronic long-term exposure, health effects of the kind we just talked about are likely.
Hey, I got to take a brief break here, but when we come back, I want to sort of dive in a little further into this whole wireless environment that we have around us. You're listening to an interview with Cindy Sage. Her name is spelled S-A-G-E, just like it sounds, of Sage Associates. Cindy, can you give out your website?
Yes, it's www.sageassociates.net.
Very simple, yes. So this is Lena Berman, Your Own Health and Fitness. We're talking about prudent exposure, smart exposure when you're dealing with various forms of radiation and electromagnetic fields. We're going to take a brief musical break, and we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Welcome back. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman. You're listening to an interview with Cindy Sage of Sage Associates. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. Cindy's website, if you'd like to get a hold of Sage and Associates, which are an environmental consulting firm, is sageassociates.net, was it?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So let's get back to our interview where we're talking about these different technologies, and let's sort of dive into this wireless world that we suddenly find ourselves in, as you say, whether we want to or not. You list a whole bunch of different names for what these things are called: the LANs, the Wi-Fi, the WiMAX, the Bluetooth, the RFID, and then there's the tagging,
right,
the antenna towers. So you've been
maybe
talking.
A little explanation about what some of these things
Yes.
are first. I think probably your listeners will have seen some of these or all of these, in fact, in the popular press, and when they go to Staples to buy something, when you have to buy a wireless router, they're frequently, offering both wired and wireless. So the choices and the names and the types of technologies are vast. But let me just talk about some of the most common that people will face decision-making about. A wireless LAN system or land area network is it's a system that allows you to connect for example, your laptops and your computers up without using wires within one room or, a building. And these are commonly proposed for schools and for libraries, where it makes it simple to have users come in and simply turn on the laptop and they can connect to the Internet. And it really is wonderful to think about the ability to do that. You don't have the wires, you don't have the mess, it's not as unsightly, and so on. That system requires a transmitting antenna either in every classroom of a school or, within a couple of rooms for coverage. And what it does is to put out a constant blanket of radio frequency signal that people are tuning into. So there is an exposure that goes with it for every person within the range of the antenna. And usually for a typical WLAN, wireless LAN system, it's about 300 feet. So it's going to cover more than a few rooms. Now, when you go to Wi-Fi or WIFI, this is a very similar operation where Starbucks, McDonald's, and others are basically putting up antennas with a little bit broader frequency adaptation where you can go into a retail store or a restaurant or an internet cafe and have the same kind of wireless connection. And again, maybe 300 feet or 400 feet of range. When you jump to WiMAX, you are talking about a much more powerful transmitter that may reach out 10 miles, and everyone within that area of 10-mile radius is able to get internet connection and communication, but they're also in that blanket of radio frequency smog. And, you know, the bigger the reach of these things, the more people will be involuntarily exposed. They may or may not know they're being exposed. They may not have given permission. They may not even have the ability to use the service without paying for it. And yet they will have the impact, the potential health impact of ill health. So these are very controversial deployments of technology that we're not thinking about enough. People don't understand that there is a downside.
In addition, you know, I've noticed that, like when I bought my newer computer, there were people buying laptops, and they were all buying the airport connection thing where they could go sit in their backyards, and you know, so they're without even thinking about what they're actually doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we think children are probably more susceptible to. I mean, their brains are still hardwiring, and their biochemistry is working at different levels than an adult. And we're very concerned about chronic exposure to kids, for children, to these fields. Now, imagine a world 30 years ago where kids read books. Today, they could be sitting in schools for 12 years with constant radio frequency exposure from, you know, wireless LAN systems, and then go home and use cordless or cell phones. This is absolutely unprecedented in human history, and it's probably, well, the Karolinska Institute calls it the largest biological experiment in human history, and I think it's not an exaggeration. But children in particular should be protected from unnecessary exposures, and every family will have to make its own choice about what necessary is.
Let's talk about the health effects, because there are people who are having symptoms. In fact, they even show up on my doorstep for a consultation that are mysterious to them, and they suspect that they've been exposed to some toxin. But some of the lists of symptoms that you have here for exposure to radio frequency radiation really sound like anybody with a chronic illness. You want to go over those?
Yeah, and if your listeners want to get a copy of the San Francisco Medical Society Journal article that I wrote on this, it's pretty comprehensive on symptoms and sources, and I'd be glad to send that out by email if people want to contact us. But the short list would be the following. Insomnia is one of the hallmarks of sleep disruption. And I'll tell you, hotels today that are putting in wireless hotspots are going to find they've done themselves a disservice, ultimately. When people figure out the reason they can't sleep in a hotel is that the hotel has gone wireless, I think there will be a blowback on that.
Yeah.
But insomnia and resulting fatigue is one of the most common symptoms, and it will happen within the first night of exposure. The second area is impairment in thinking. Cognitive function is really adversely affected, and you just can't think. You have fuzzy thinking, loss of concentration. It's like thinking against a force field.
Sounds like
describe it that way.
Sounds like people who think they have attention deficit disorder.
Yeah, well, you know, no one is yet saying they know the answer, but we are very concerned about autism, Alzheimer's, and attention deficit disorders as potentially related.
Especially for people living in, I'm talking over you, I'm sorry. I think you and I are used to being able to do that with each other, so I apologize to the audience for doing that. But particularly because people don't know whether they're being exposed. If they're living in an urban environment, they may well be getting exposed to things without realizing it.
Right. Well, there's a simple device that we use and recommend a lot that they can purchase if they do have concerns. Throw it in a pocket, and when you're in a field that's a couple of microwatts per centimeter squared, it'll beep at you. So at least you know if you're in a big field.
Is that something people can find out by going to your website as well?
They can.
Okay, sageassociates.net. Also, if you want to email her for this article. But go ahead with the symptoms.
It's called a micro-alert, and we can tell people how to buy them. We don't sell them, but
I like the idea of beeping.
Yep.
You know, you're sitting next to someone in a cell phone and you start beeping at them.
Right. It's fun in airports when someone comes up and sits next to you and starts using a cell phone in your ear, and there's no escape in an airport. Your little beeper goes off, and at first they look annoyed, and then they realize it's them and not you, and they slink off. It's protective. Anyway, the other things that people would report almost immediately would be disorientation or difficulty in remembering which way to turn. You just can't remember directions. Interferes with mental map making and so on.
Great in a car.
Yeah, we use them in a car. Anyway, and the other really one that keeps coming again and again is heart arrhythmias. changes in heart rhythm are extremely common when you're in this for hours at a time, whether it's in front of your own wireless laptop or using a phone in a car where you're in a confined space.
What about if you're in an office and they've gone wireless?
Well, we have a number of reports from people who are really incapacitated, and it's a very serious thing to have heart arrhythmias because all the protocols for medical treatment involve drugs and lifestyle changes that are major. And I shared with you a report from a woman physician in the United Kingdom who put in a wireless home system, and within a couple of weeks was having such severe heart arrhythmia that she was on the verge of doing some major medical treatment, then was told that she should shut the system down to see if it might be contributing. And in fact, her symptoms vanished. She was a healthy 49-year-old woman. But this is, again, it's just a typical story of someone who, doesn't realize that in making a choice for wireless, you may also be, getting some health effects in the bargain. Other changes, particularly in young people that are noticeable, are irritability, anxiety, and changes in coping behavior. And one of the things that school districts are contemplating now is that if they are going to go wireless, they're going to keep track of behavioral and disruptive changes in school, children's behavior, and they're also going to have to offer classrooms that are still wired. So we're now looking at those kinds of compromises for schools that want to plow ahead with wireless. Vertigo, dizziness, and the resulting nausea from vertigo are common, and immune system dysfunction is something that occurs but is usually going to take a little time to turn up. By the time you've tested for it, some period of time has gone by.
And where are the federal standards?
Well, they're several million times higher, unfortunately, than these effects that are occurring. This is a large area now of international controversy, but the short version is this. Today, in this country, the FCC governs radio frequency radiation based on thermal standards, or heating effect in tissue. And the problem is that the literature is telling us, the science is telling us, that it's not heating that is causing the problem. It is information contained with very little energy transfer. It is the direction the radio frequency gives to your body that is received as static or misinformation that causes major changes in the functioning of the human body, particularly in terms of stress, and that's physiological stress, the creation of stress proteins, oxidative stress, and DNA damage. The federal standard today, for example, for a typical cell phone in the 800 to 900 megahertz range is about 580 microwatts per centimeter squared, and just remember the number, it's about 580 microwatts. We are seeing health effects down at 1/10 of a microwatt in ordinary people, and 1/100th of a microwatt or lower in people who are electrically sensitive. And anybody can become electrically sensitive over time.
Right. That's what I was just going to say. What would make somebody become electrically sensitive? And I would say either exposure or the idea that their immune system is already compromised and they're not able to handle. Because these changes that you're talking about, these protein changes and genetic changes, like I said, are going to cause a chronic inflammation state. Right. And that's what people who are chronically ill have, whether it's chronic fatigue or anything else. Stress-related illnesses are all like this too. So if you have somebody who has had a stressful life or a traumatic childhood, whose body struggles with fight or flight state anyway, and then you expose them to this stuff, there's just a limit to sort of the proverbial straw on the camel's back. I mean, there's just one last one, and the animal goes down, or the human goes down with symptoms. So,
well,
spillover.
Again, it comes back to getting educated and making choices. And one of the real finds lately we've had is a consulting firm that is just involved in, they're a tech firm you call when you're going to set up a system. Diana Rains, R-A-I-N-S, Diana Rains and Associates in Sacramento.
Can you spell her name again?
Diana Rains, R-A-I-N-S. Diana Rains and Associates is the company name. They're a technology, information company. They help set up businesses and homes. And they're very smart about choosing wired systems, meaning Ethernet cable installations and everything as an option to wireless.
Yeah, just before we move on to that, let me just briefly ID the show. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman on the phone with Cindy Sage, S-A-G-E. Her website, sageassociates.net. She's very graciously offered to email people an article that she wrote with a lot of this information in it, if you want that. Also, there is information on the website on how to get a little device that beeps you when you're receiving too much radio frequency radiation. Does that device also work for electromagnetic fields?
No, it does not.
Too bad. We need another one that beeps when your electromagnetic field. Somebody,
actually,
please.
I don't have a website, but I do have a phone number for Diana Raines and Associates if you'd like to provide it later or now.
Go ahead.
Yes, it's area 916-977-0100.
Okay, so again, Diana Raines, which is a company that people can hire to set up a wired system that works as well as the wireless. And their number looks like Sacramento is 916-977-0100.
And I think it's great when people come to you and say, well, what am I going to do without my, whatever it is? And you can say, look, this is only a short period of time in our history where wireless seemed like a good idea, but there was a time before it, and there will be a time after it.
Well, when we did a show ages ago, it was so funny because this was at the point where the cell phones were just starting to be much stronger. I mean, there were still a few 900. This is when 900 megahertz was a high amount of radiation, and you were telling people to use headsets with them and stuff like this. And now, forget about it. You can sometimes find a 900. I was able to find a few 900s, which I use with headsets if I need to be moving. But I just switched to, corded 2-line phones for the offices here, and they're headset compatible. I mean, Panasonic makes one that's headset compatible. 2-line phone works beautifully.
Wired headset.
Wired. I'm talking about everything is wired. And when we went ahead and got finally here out in the boonies in the redwoods, the ability to do the cable high-speed internet, which we jumped for joy, we actually did get a wired router, and Jeffrey, strung this wire along the deer fence, because my office to his office is like maybe a quarter of a city block. I mean, it's a really long distance. So, but it works fine. It's just this white wire that goes along the top of the deer fence. It's not a big deal to do this,
and it works.
It works brilliantly. I mean, there's just absolutely no difference in the way it works. It works great.
Right. Well, that's exactly the kind of thinking that people should have a choice, and it does come down to just simple choices like that if they know. One thing I wanted to say, Lena, was that the new Bluetooth headsets or wireless headsets really have an awful lot of radio frequency exposure. And you can get a wired headset with zero exposure, so make a good choice there. The Bluetooth headsets and many of these wireless LAN setups actually have FCC exemptions from consideration of radio frequency.
Oh, no.
They're under an 802.11 exemption, which means people always think that, well, if they're on the market, they have to be safe because, the federal government said so. But in fact, the class of devices we're talking about is exempt, and many of these devices are on the market today with no warning other than maybe interference, but certainly not health effects. So, a wired headset is a good idea, and for a cell phone, a really good wired headset includes a little bit of hollow. There's part of the wire that goes from the phone to your ear doesn't have a metal section in it. It's hollow, and these are absolutely the most safe if you're going to be using a headset with a phone, and of course you should be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, continue to tell us about some of the options that we have that are not painful, that allow us to still have this life where we can communicate easily.
Right. Well, obviously, the obvious list is, choose wired, not wireless. Particularly in schools, don't let your children use cell phones at all. Then you would be consistent with many medical societies in Europe now that are urging that. If you have to use a cell phone, absolutely use a headset every single time. Limit the length of your cell phone calls and your cordless phone calls. Use a landline with zero radiation for your longer calls, and avoid Bluetooth. And that includes the headset and the cards for wireless laptops. Obviously, use your dollars here to vote. If you feel that there is something to be concerned about here, avoid Starbucks and McDonald's and let them know why. Wireless
maybe anyway. Maybe
anyway. Well, God knows. And let restaurants and internet cafes and particularly hotels know that you object to this involuntary exposure, if they're a wireless hotspot when you shop or travel. Another important thing is that if you're going to get a new cell phone, you know now that you can look up the SAR value.
This is new.
Yeah, specific absorption rate, or SAR, is the number. It's the value that tells you how much radiation that cell phone uses. And it's an important thing to choose your next phone with a very low SAR value. How do you do that? Well, you can go to a website, and I'll give it here. It's an independent website that lists literally every phone that is made, every phone on the market. And the website is www.sarvalues.com. www.sarvalues.com. And, today the limit for cell phones is 1.6. The SAR is 1.6. My old Nokia it had an SAR that was very high. It was 1.46. You can now buy a nice new phone at 0.2 SAR.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I went to the sarvalues.com, and I noted that many of the lowest radiation phones are Motorola.
They are.
Which is kind of interesting, since you said Motorola was...
Well, they've done good. They've done a good job of knowing the market is going to go to low SAR phones. At the same time, they're squashing a lot of the independent research, and they're skewing a lot that they do research designs for, in my opinion. And they're marketing actively to Disney to put out kiddie phones, cell phones for kids, and so on. So I have to say that I think that Motorola needs to have a reality check on its corporate policies, because children in the UK today are being the parents are being urged to take phones away from children under 8. They shouldn't be used at all, and to really monitor and require headsets for the youth market, which goes up to age 16. And Motorola really needs to get with it and be a good, corporate, neighbor. But the SAR value is important to choose a low one, and obviously there's an evolving cell phone and driving protocol people should observe. And if this doesn't happen, I think we're going to see cell phone bans, both handheld and the hands-free in cars. And we're at a critical point in time because we see the collision rate is increased. So people need to be more prudent about using a phone in a car. First, don't do it if you can avoid it. But if you do, don't return calls while driving where you have to dial. Turn off the phone while you're in the car, and then when you get to your destination, check and return your messages when you arrive at a safe spot. And remember again that in rural areas with a weaker radio frequency signal, you're getting a lot more signal into your head, so get out of the car to make that call or roll down your window. Or do this when you see a lot of bars on your phone so the signal is stronger. If you find you're in a weak area of signal, don't keep calling back when you've lost the call, because the highest point of radiation output for the phone is when you're dialing, when it's dialing to find its party. So don't keep doing that because you're getting a huge amount of radiation into your head. Get a built-in car phone jack where you actually put the antenna on the outside of the car, and then there's zero radio frequency inside, which is
really
the best of all possible worlds. Yeah.
So why is it that the hands-free didn't do better in the tests about accidents?
Because I think what they were measuring was the antenna inside the car.
So
you have to actually find a kit to put the antenna outside where there's then no RF.
But if you're someone who has to, in your work, you're a real estate agent or something, and you have to have this, then if you get an antenna hookup outside the car and you use the cell phone, does that mean that it's safer to drive in that situation, or you still should be stopping the car and pulling over?
Lena, great question. It's probably not safer in terms of collision, but it certainly is in terms of absorbed radiation. Here's the thing: we've been dancing around and not saying is that The studies are showing that hands-free and handheld cell phones have the same accident rate, and the reason is the brain uses the same part of the brain, the neurons that you need for, visual, spatial orientation for driving are the same ones you tend to use when you're making a call and talking to someone remotely. And the brain has to divide its attention. It's called inattention blindness. So it's simply, you're lacking the capacity to do two tasks that use the same part of the brain at the same time.
So does that mean that if you're riding in a car with somebody and you're late to an appointment and somebody else calls to say we're on our way, is that still going to affect the driver?
That's probably pretty short.
Okay.
I think it's an exaggeration to go that far, but
so you can do a quick call like that. Somebody else riding with you can make a quick call just to say we're on our way.
That's probably fine. But
okay.
I always laugh when people, in the industry say people need cell phones in their cars in case they have an accident. Well, they're probably reporting an accident that was caused by using a cell phone.
Oh, great! And do these cell phones now, which also wash dishes and show home movies and take pictures and all those, is that just increasing the radiation, or are those just totally different things that have nothing to do with the radiation?
Lena, I don't know the answer to that.
Oh, gosh, something you don't know. That's amazing.
But I'll look it up.
Okay, so we've talked about some prudent avoidance, and certainly these websites are really helpful. So we have the website sarvalues.com. Right. We have Cindy Sage's website, which is sageassociates.net. We have the number of a woman who sets up wired systems for people who have offices and want not to use the wireless, so that they can have the convenience of the technology without the wireless radiation. Diane Rains, is it right? R-A-I-N-S?
Right, Diana
Rains. And her phone number in the Sacramento Valley in California is 916-977-0100. Again, 916-977-0100. Is that on your website, too, if they don't?
No, I've just found her, and it's not yet on my website,
okay.
But it will be soon.
Okay. And I'm trying to think of what else we gave out that we should. And you mentioned that you're willing to email people an article going.
Yeah, the San Francisco Medical Society Journal article is a good overview written for Bay Area physicians so they can help people who are having symptoms and don't know what they might be related to.
And lastly, I would say take your vitamins and antioxidants to help you with all this exposure that you don't even know you're getting. So we've got to let you go. It's always terrific to have you on the show. You're such a wealth of information, Cindy Sage.
Thank you, Lena.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for listening. I'm Lena Berman. If you need more information, or if you want a cassette copy of this or any other in the series, Your Own Health and Fitness, you can call my information number 24 hours a day at 707-874-2772. For a list of other available shows or information about guests, go to the website YourOwnHealthandFitness.com. Also, there's information on subscribing to the newsletter, Progressive Health Observer, a news commentary alternative to big box medicine. Your Own Health and Fitness is a joint production of Your Own Health and Fitness, 8.5 by 11 Productions, and KPFA-FM. The engineer for Your Own Health and Fitness is Vinnie Beecham. Remember, being informed not only protects your health, it protects your freedom.